Is Israel an apartheid society? Well, I think you have to understand the origins of Zionism, which is the movement and ideology which created Israel. And the origins of Zionism lay in the upsurge in anti-Semitism in Tsarist Russia, in particular the pogroms in Odessa and elsewhere as a result of the assassination of Tsar Alexander II in 1881. Out of that, there were a whole series of pogroms, and that led to the formation of the first proto-Zionist organization, the Lovers of Zion, in 1882. The key figure in that was a guy named Leo Pinsker. He was a doctor, and he summed up really the Zionist attitude to anti-Semitism when he said Judeophobia, because he was a doctor, so he described it in terms of a fear of an illness. Judeophobia then was a mental disease, and as such it was hereditary, and having been inherited for 2,000 years, it was incurable. And this was the Zionist attitude to anti-Semitism, which distinguished them from just about every other Jewish reaction to anti-Semitism that existed at the time. Namely, that if anti-Semitism was incurable, then there was no point in fighting it. And their project was to form a separate Jewish state, and the chosen place for religious and other reasons was Palestine. And this continued. From Lovers of Zionism, there became what was called the first Aliyah, the first emigration to Palestine, from say 1882 up to 1904, where people went to Palestine, and with the aid of Jewish magnates who funded them, in particular Baron Edmund Rothschild, they formed particular settlements, Rishon LeZion, Petach Tikva, and so on. However, this was not really a Zionist emigration because they were more like traditional planters. In other words, they had the Arabs, the Palestinians, doing the work while they sat back. And that was a traditional mode of colonization. Zionism was, however, very different. And the formation of the first Zionist Congress was 1897, and that was called by a man, Theodor Herzl, who was the founder of political Zionism. He was, a journalist in Vienna. He worked for the New Free Press, which was owned by Jewish people, but it wasn't a Zionist paper. And he was based in Paris. And he summed up there the attitude of Zionism to anti-Semitism when he said, and I quote from his diaries, the complete diaries of Theodor Herzl, "In Paris, then, I gained a freer attitude towards anti-Semitism, which I now began to understand historically and make allowances for. Above all, I recognized the emptiness and futility of efforts to combat anti-Semitism." And this was the attitude of Zionism. Not only did they think it was futile to combat anti-Semitism, but they actually understood anti-Semitism. They understood that the anti-Semitism was in many ways a quite legitimate and understandable movement because it resented the Jewish stranger in their midst. If I quote from another leading Zionist, Jacob Klatskin, who edited the first Zionist paper, Die Welt, he said, "If we do not admit the rightfulness of anti-Semitism, we deny the rightfulness of our own nationalism. Instead of establishing societies for defense against the anti-Semites who wanted to reduce our rights, we should establish societies for defense against our friends who desire to defend our rights." So this was the Zionist attitude, that really you could use anti-Semitism in order to stimulate Jewish emigration to Palestine. And there's a whole history, which I wouldn't have time to go into, whereby the Zionists worked with, collaborated with anti-Semites, and that included the Nazi era itself. And this attitude, of course, was resented by the vast majority of Jews who had fought bitterly for their own rights in the West, and resented the activities of Zionists who effectively were saying that the anti-Semites were right in their demands. and one person, Montefiore, an English MP, I think he was the MP for Stepney, argued, observed, he wrote in The Dangers of Zionism, is it not a suspicious fact that those who have no love for the Jews and those who are pronounced anti-Semites all seem to welcome the Zionist proposals and aspirations? And that was true. I can give you another example. Theodor Herzl had a strategy, and that strategy was to win the favors of a particular imperialist power, and he didn't mind which one, who would enable the Zionists to colonize Palestine. And he went around Europe speaking to the German Kaiser, the Pope, Victor Emmanuel of Italy, the Pope even, and many other dignitaries. And one he met was the Grand Duke of Baden, because Germany at that time was still, well, I mean, it was unified, but the princes and the relatives of the Kaiser were still very strong. The Grand Duke was the uncle of the Kaiser, and Theodor Herzl asked him to support Zionism, which he was only willing to do. But he said the only problem we had was that if he supported Zionism, he would be accused of anti-Semitism. So this is quite ironic today, when, of course, the charge of anti-Semitism is frequently laid at our doors. Now, Zionism was in a sense different from traditional colonization. And it was in this sense that when Britain went to India, for example, or Africa and elsewhere, its project was to exploit the labor power of the natives and to extract the natural resources from the ground. And it was quite conscious. It drove the Africans off their land as subsistence farmers and peasants, and re-employed them, reintegrated them into the labor force in order to produce the vast profits the British Empire lived off. In Palestine, the Zionist project was entirely different, and this relates to the present apartheid state of Israel. Zionism wanted to create a new Jewish nation in the land of Palestine. It didn't want to exploit the Palestinians or the Arabs, but to exclude them, first from their economy and then from the society and the state altogether. And they had three slogans: Jewish land, Jewish labor, and Jewish produce. Jewish land meant when you bought up land, you redeemed it. This was the word that they used, to redeem, which meant that forevermore in a day, no non-Jew would ever use that land, would ever have access to land. Jewish labor meant, and Histadrut, the Zionist so-called trade union, a trade union which didn't admit Arabs as members, campaigned on the slogan of Jewish labor. And that meant that they campaigned for Jewish employers to only employ Jewish labor. And they picketed out in the orange groves and so on, Arab labor, because obviously employers want to employ someone at the cheapest price possible, and Arab labor was cheaper than Jewish labor. So you had this kind of apartheid trade union. And if I can just find a quote, hoping nothing is going to happen to my internet this time around. And it's from David Hacohen, who is the managing director of Solel Bonner, which was the Histadrut building company. I should, right, it's not giving it me. Let me try another way. Yeah, that's okay, fine. Histadrut was formed in 1920 by the two Zionist labor parties, Hapoel Hatzer and Poel Zion, Achdut HaAvodah. And it was not so much a trade union, but it was, in the words of Golda Meir, later to become an Israeli prime minister, a general colonizing agency. It owned, in Israel until the 1980s, it was the second largest employer after the state itself. So it was both a trade union and an employer. But until 1959, it refused admittance to Arabs. And until 1966, it still called itself the General Confederation of Hebrew Labour. So it was an apartheid trade union, and in effect it campaigned where it couldn't exclude Palestinians altogether from the labour force, such as in the civil service. It campaigned for higher wages, in essence a colour bar in all but name. And David Hacohen was a managing director of one of the largest companies that Histadrut owned, Salel Bonaire, the building company. It was one of the few Histadrut enterprises which employed Arabs, mainly because it was simply manual labour and most Jews didn't want to do it. And Hacohen reflected on the situation of Zionist socialism, and he said, quote, "I had to fight my friends on the issue of Jewish socialism, to defend the fact that I would not accept Arabs in my trade union, the Histadrut, to defend preaching to housewives that they should not buy at Arab stores, to defend the fact that we'd stood guard at orchards to prevent Arab workers from getting jobs there, to pour kerosene on Arab tomatoes, to attack Jewish housewives in the market and smash Arab eggs they had bought, to buy dozens of dunhams, that's a quarter of an acre, from an Arab is permitted, but to sell, God forbid, one Jewish dunham to an Arab is prohibited. To take Rothschild, the incarnation of capitalism, as a socialist, and to name him the benefactor, to do all that was not easy, but nonetheless, they did it." And that structure carried over into the Israeli state. The first major Zionist organization, because the Zionist organization, which was founded in 1897, set up a number of different subsidiary organizations to carry out the work of the Zionist movement. One was the Palestine Land Development Bank, which, as you can imagine, was a bank which purchased land. Another one was the Jewish National Fund, which you may have heard of. It was formed in 1901, and its specific task was to buy up as much Arab land as possible, normally from absentee Arab landlords, and then to evict the peasants, and then just to employ Jewish labor on that land. And most of those settlements became what you know as kibbutzim. And when I grew up as a Zionist, I was told that the kibbutzim were the quintessential examples of socialism in the world. But I wasn't told, of course, that kibbutzim refused to have Arabs as members. In other words, they were Jewish-only organizations. There were stockade and watchtower settlements. And the Jewish National Fund's activities carry on today. The JNF didn't cease operation with the declaration of the Israeli state of Israeli independence in 1948. On the contrary, in I think it was 1953, the Israeli state passed, the Knesset passed a law, the Jewish National Fund law, in essence, incorporating the Jewish National Fund as a quasi-state organization. And to the Jewish National Fund was passed about 1 million dunhams of confiscated Arab land, because 750,000 Palestinian refugees had been expelled in 1947-48. And even those who had not been expelled, the 150,000 Arabs who had remained for various reasons, or who they hadn't been able to ethnically cleanse, nonetheless, the majority of them had their land confiscated. It was under a law, the 1950 absentee property law, which held that if they moved from their village even a mile to take shelter, or in the case of Kfar Birim and Ikrit, where the Zionist militias told the Arabs to move out, but they could move back once hostilities were over, they were declared what was termed present absentees. It's an Orwellian term. In other words, you were present, but at the same time you were absent. And the Jewish National Fund was allocated the vast majority of this land, and it was to use it for Jewish settlement. And in the Jewish nation state law, which was passed in 2018, Jewish settlement is held as a national value. And it's strange that in a state which contains Palestinians as well as Jews, only Jewish settlement should be a national value. This law, which fell into, I suppose, disuse after the land had been confiscated, has been resurrected along with another law, the Land and Administration Law of 1970, in East Jerusalem today. And I'm sure you're aware of the confiscation or the attempted confiscation of homes in Sheikh Jarrah. If I can point out, this attempt to settle, because colonization is an ongoing process in Israel. It didn't stop in 1948. It has been an ongoing process ever since the foundation of the state. And there is a master plan. In fact, there are 3 master plans for Jerusalem, the aim of which is to create a Jewish majority of at least 70 to 30. It's called Judaization, and the same process has occurred in the south, in the Negev, the semi-desert area, and also in the Galilee, where the majority of Israeli Palestinians are concentrated. So you can imagine what kind of a state it is that looks at a particular area of the country and says we have to have a majority of Jews there. Imagine in Britain, the government said that in London we have to ensure a white majority. I don't think anyone would doubt for 1 minute that that was a racist form of planning, but that is accepted as the norm in the state of Israel. And in Sheikh Jarrah, you have families who've been living since 1948 in their homes. And because those homes were originally owned by Jews, it's been decreed that they have to move out and hand it over, not to the original Jews, incidentally, but to Jewish settlers, Ateret HaKohanim and others who want to Judaize the area. Why is it racist? Because, of course, no equivalent provision exists for the 45,000 Palestinians who were forced to leave West Jerusalem in the 1948 war, when Jerusalem was divided between East and West. So Jews who own land in East Jerusalem are able to reclaim it, but no such provision exists for Palestinians. And why? Because it's a Jewish state. And that's why a Jewish state is inherently racist. Now, of course, Zionism today calls itself a movement of Jewish self-determination, which of course is a nonsense, because you can't self-determine yourself at the expense of somebody else. But in fact, this is a complete nonsense. Zionism has tried to fit in with the zeitgeist of the present age and talk such as and formulations such as national determination. But in its original years, right up to 1948 and beyond, Zionism itself called itself a colonizatory movement. It set up, for instance, the Jewish Colonization Association, and there's a Jewish Colonization Bank. And if I quote from Theodor Herzl again, it's page 1194, the complete diaries of Theodor Herzl. There is a letter that he wrote. There's a letter that he wrote to Cecil Rhodes. I'm sure you'll know who Cecil Rhodes is. Rhodesia was named after him, and he was one of the leaders of the colonization of South Africa. And I think it was the Prime Minister of the Cape Colony. And he said, Herzl said in a letter to him, "How then do I happen to turn to you, since this is an out-of-the-way matter for you? How indeed? Because it is something colonial. But you, Mr. Rhodes," and I've left it out a bit, "but you, Mr. Rhodes, are a visionary politician or a practical visionary. You've already demonstrated this. And what I want you to do is not to give me or lend me a few guineas, but to put the stamp of your authority on the Zionist plan and to make the following declaration to a few people." So it was extremely clear in the writings of not only Theodor Herzl, but David Ben-Gurion, who was the first prime minister of the state of Israel, and others, that Zionism was always a colonizatory movement, a settler colonial movement. And of course, it rebelled in the lead up to 1948 against the British overlords, but that didn't make it any form of national liberation or resistance movement. They were following the same path as the South African Boers, the Afrikaners, who fought 2 wars, the two Boer Wars against Britain. It's not unusual for settler colonials, whether it was in South Africa America or Palestine to rebel against the colonial power. But that didn't therefore make it any form of, say, resistance or national liberation movement. But why today is Israel an apartheid state? Well, what is apartheid? I mean, there are the original definition. I'm just saying, do let me know if I'm running over time. The original definition of apartheid in South Africa was separate development. And B'Tselem, the main human rights agency in Israel, has come out and declared that Israel is an apartheid state. And it's quite simply, it is the domination of one racial group over another. And that is exactly the case in Israel today. For example, you have segregated education, and the Arab education sector receives about a third per capita funding of the Jewish education system. You have a system whereby Jewish students can get grants at universities, but Palestinian Israelis can't, because the ability to gain a grant is tied to whether you or your relatives have served in the Israeli army. And of course, Arabs don't serve in that army. Even the mixed cities, such as Haifa and Lod and Bat Yam, there's no true integration in those cities. It's just that Arabs live on the margins of those cities in areas from which the original population of Palestinians were expelled in 1948. And you can go right through Israeli society. And so you had the phenomena with the attacks on Gaza, whereby Israeli Jews began attacking Palestinians and organizing what were pogroms with the aid of the border police and the military. That is the point to understand. A Jewish state, by definition, is a racist state. It's a Jewish supremacist state in exactly the same way as Northern Ireland is or was a Protestant supremacist state. And I have to say, the history of Ireland and the history of Palestine has uncanny parallels. Arthur Balfour, who was responsible, if you may recall, for the Balfour Declaration in 1917, in which Britain promised the land of the Palestinians to the Zionists, was also known as Bloody Balfour, because he was chief minister in Ireland. And I think it was 1888, there's the massacre, the shooting of 3 demonstrators in Mitchellstown in Cork. Sir Ronald Storrs, who was, Sir Ronald Storrs was the first military governor in Jerusalem from 1920 to 26. Asked, why do we support the idea of a Jewish state? Because Zionism, it would be a little royal Ulster in a sea of hostile pan-Arabism. And that is in his autobiography, Orientations, which was written in 1937. So the British imperialists certainly saw Palestine, where there was a stable Zionist colony adjacent to the Suez Canal, in the same terms as the Irish state, the Northern Ireland statehood, and not without reason. For example, the Black and Tans, when they finished their work in Ireland, they came over to Palestine to quell any Arab uprisings, led by someone called, I think it was Reginald Duff, from which the term duffed up originates, because as you know, they were quite a brutal force. So there are many parallels, and you will be aware that the loyalists, the unionists, have always supported the Israelis, the Zionists, whereas the Republican movement has supported the Palestinians. And although I'm very active in Palestine solidarity, I used to be active in the Troops Out movement as well. And I was part of a Labour Party delegation from Brighton to Northern Ireland in the early 80s. And as part of that delegation, we met Andy Tyrie and John McMichael of the UDA. And we put to them why they did support Israel, because at that time, Israel had invaded Lebanon, killing thousands of Lebanese and Palestinians. And they told us that they saw it as part of the same anti-terrorist fight. They identified completely with the Israeli state and the way they had attacked the PLO at that time. So I hope that I've given you at least a background to what is happening in Palestine. say we are in interesting times. Both Human Rights Watch and B'Tselem, the main Israeli human rights organization, have now come out and said that Israel is an apartheid state, a state of Jewish supremacy. And this has been taken up by a few progressive congressmen, such as Alexander Ocasio-Cortez, and of course Rashid Tlaib and Ilhan Omar and Cory Bush. This is really quite new, and I think it's very promising, because what Israel fears above all is what they call delegitimization. They want to be seen as just another Western democracy, but situated in the Middle East. And I think the mask is slipping from their face. So we are in quite interesting times. I'll leave it at there, and I'm happy to take any questions. Thank you.